If you've stumbled upon any form of NES Tetris, you may have seen players hitting the backs of their controller and thought to yourself, just what am I looking at? This is what's known as rolling. Rolling is the third playstyle in NES Tetris, and by far the best. The first playstyle, known as Dash, involves holding the D-pad down to use the in-game horizontal movement, and the second playstyle, known as Hyper Tap, involves manually tapping the D-pad more than 10 times a second to move the pieces. These two playstyles were both good in their own rights, and allowed players to get scores well over 1,000,000 points. However, where they fell short was when the game reached level 29, also known as the kill screen. On this level, the pieces fall one row every 1/60th of a second, and Dash and Hyper Tap simply weren't fast enough to consistently keep up. However, in late 2020, the player Cheese took inspiration from retro legend Flyhack's finger techniques and came up with the revolutionary idea to roll his fingers on the back of the controller. With this new method, your pieces now soared all over the board at speeds up to 30 times a second, allowing players to finally conquer the kill screen and the game itself.
Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god!
Breaking down how rolling works, there are two main parts. Your anchor hand, the hand that holds the controller, and your rolling hand, the hand that hits the controller. The thumb of your anchor hand lightly applies pressure onto the D-pad, so that when you hit the back with your rolling hand, you end up pushing the D-pad into your thumb. By doing this with multiple fingers in quick succession, you could potentially have the game input a command every other frame, which translates to being able to move the pieces at the maximum speed the game allows. Now, while rolling is exciting to watch and very fun to do, trying to learn how to roll can be extremely daunting. Knowing how to hold the controller, which fingers to use, and how to roll in general may seem impossible to figure out at a first glance. However, this is the video that will help you with all of that. My name is Tristop, current holder of the 4th highest score in the world, and today, I will be your guide in teaching you everything you need to know about rolling. To start this guide, we'll first cover the foundation of all rolling, which is the grip you use. There are many different ways players anchor and roll the controller, so to help decide which is best for you, I'll be going over all notable grips as well as the benefits and challenges of each. The first and possibly most important decision when choosing your grip is if you want to be a left-hand or right-hand roller. On the surface, this may seem like a simple question, but there are major factors that differ depending on which hand you use. First is the orientation of the controller. When rolling with the left hand, the controller is oriented upright, while when rolling with the right hand, the controller is upside down. This causes your inputs to be reversed when right hand rolling. In this aspect, left hand rolling is more intuitive since you wouldn't have to relearn the muscle memory to use backwards controls. However, most of the population is right-handed and would have a harder time rolling with their left. There do exist special controllers called Goofy Foots where the inputs are naturally reversed. However, if you do plan on rolling with your right hand, I recommend that you simply drill in the muscle memory of backwards controls since it doesn't take too long, and once you have it down, you'll keep it forever. The last difference between which hand you use is the space you have to support the controller. When rolling, your anchor hand will have 3 main parts: the thumb on the D-pad, 1 or 2 fingers to rotate, and the rest of the fingers to support the controller. When comparing left hand and right hand rolling, you can see that with the left hand, you don't have much space for support since the buttons are so close to the bottom, whereas with the right hand, there's a lot more room to hold down the controller. This would mean right hand rolling is theoretically more consistent since the extra space you have for support would give you much more stability. Of course, there isn't a definitive better hand to use, which is evident when looking at the top players. Alex T, the current world champion, and Dog, the current world record holder and first to achieve Rebirth, both use their left hand to roll, while Blue Scooty, the first player to crash the game, as well as me, both use our right hand to roll. So in the end, whichever hand you use really boils down to personal preference. After deciding which hand to use, the next step is deciding where to place your controller. The 3 main positions players often use are top of the thigh, side of the thigh, and foot grip. Starting with the top of the thigh grip, players place their controllers, well, on the top of their thigh. This grip is best seen in the 2022 World Championship Finals, where both players utilize this placement using opposite hands as well. Typically, players place the controller on the same leg as their anchor hand, so that their rolling hand can naturally reach the controller. However, the founder of rolling, Cheese, actually places his controller on the leg opposite his anchor hand. This causes his rolling arm to jut out. However, Cheese says doing this isn't uncomfortable and in fact gives him the best angle to roll on the controller. Next, we move to the side of the thigh grip. This is the grip I personally use, as well as other top players like Dog and Miles. This grip involves placing the controller flat against the thigh of your rolling hand, which will set the controller upright. I found this grip comfortable because your anchor hand will be facing sideways. This is a pretty natural position to hold, whereas with the top thigh grip, you might be straining your wrist by placing it horizontally. One match where you can best see the left and right hand variants is the aforementioned Miles vs Dog of the 2024 World Championships, where Miles uses his right hand and Dog uses his left hand. Finally, we get to foot grip. With foot grip, players bend their legs outwards and use the base of their foot to firmly hold the controller. This is what's used by Blue Scooty, who is kind enough to answer some questions regarding this grip. When learning how to roll, Scooty says that using foot grip was slightly uncomfortable at first, however there was never fatigue during long sessions and he quickly got used to the position. Scooty chose this grip because he felt the foot gave a much larger area to roll on and the grip felt more stable overall than placing the controller against his leg. One challenge with foot grip is that the foot can become numb after a while. However, to combat this, adjust the foot the second you feel it falling asleep. I wasn't able to find any matches where both players were clearly shown using foot grip. However, instead, you can watch the streams of Alex T and Blue Scooty, who both use this grip with Alex using his left hand and Scooty using his right. The final aspect to cover about grip are the fingers used to support the controller. With the thumb being used to move left and right, this leaves 4 fingers for rotation and keeping the controller stable. The main decision with your support fingers is whether you want to use 1 finger or 2 fingers to rotate. I personally only use 1 finger to rotate, which gives me more fingers for support but makes it virtually impossible to do multiple rotation techniques like the Buko spin. Other players, like Sodium, use 2 fingers to rotate. This not only allows him to do moves like the Buko spin, but also lets him be ready to rotate in any direction. This is incredibly useful for adjustments where being ready to rotate quickly is crucial. However, once again, by using fewer fingers, you are sacrificing support. Once you have your grip figured out, the next step is deciding how you want to hit the controller. The most you would ever need to move a piece is 5 taps to the left, so the puzzle players have to solve is what combination of fingers works best for these 5 taps. To avoid confusion, I'll be referring to the thumb as finger 1 and the pinky as finger 5. We'll start by going over 2 of the most common rolling patterns, which are pinky to thumb and thumb to pinky. With pinky to thumb, the interior of each finger makes contact as you curl your hand inwards. With thumb to pinky, you hit the back of your thumb upwards and curl your hand outwards. While most players use the patterns just mentioned, your finger order is in no way limited to just these 2. For example, former world record holder Huffaluffagus does thumb directly into pinky with an order of 1-5-4-3-2, and the player Neko uses his thumb twice with an order of 1-4-3-2-1, eliminating the need to use pinky at all. For movements under 5 inputs, such as getting a right while Tetris, the finger order really depends on what feels best for you. For example, I go from ring finger to thumb for 1 to 4 taps and only add in the pinky for 5 taps, while other players will start on pinky and only reserve their thumb for 5 taps. Make sure that your chosen finger order for these lower taps is as comfortable and consistent as possible, since you will be doing these much more than the maximum 5 taps. Moving on, sometimes getting every one of the fingers to consistently input can be hard. Some players rather not deal with the trouble of getting one problem finger to work, so instead, they employ a technique called the quick tap. Instead of only rolling with one hand for 5 taps, quick tappers will roll the first 4 fingers as usual, but now, they push in the thumb already on the D-pad to get the final tap in. When comparing traditional rolling and quick tapping, there are several advantages and disadvantages that come with both. Starting with traditional rolling, the main advantage is that this method only relies on the technique of the roller, meaning once you master your rolling, you can replicate it every time. This is in contrast to quick tapping, where 5 taps rely on timing rather than technique. However, the main challenge of traditional rolling is how hard it is to master. As mentioned earlier, sometimes one of your fingers just won't cooperate no matter how hard you try. Speaking from personal experience, it took a very long time to separate my pinky input from my ring finger input, where they'd clump together and only register as one movement. This makes learning 5 taps a potential major roadblock for anyone who decides not to quick tap. Now moving on to the strengths and weaknesses of quick tapping, where I've enlisted the help of the current world record holder Dog to share his experiences. Initially, Dog decided to try quick tapping after having trouble using his thumb to roll. This route worked perfectly for him, and the 2-time world champion with Hyper Tap would eventually emerge as one of the greatest rollers as well. According to Dog, an advantage to using quick taps is that your rolling technique stays the same for both 4 and 5 taps. This is very useful since if you're consistent with 4 taps, your 5 taps will be consistent as well. Granted, you can get the timing down. However, on the topic of timing, relying on it can be seen as a double-edged sword, with 5 taps often being the difference between life and death. If your timing is off, getting pieces to the left on higher speeds may seem impossible. However, if your timing is good, 5 taps through quick tapping can be extremely consistent. I've even started implementing quick taps with traditional rolling, performing a backup 6 tap just in case I miss an input with any of my fingers. This has greatly improved my play, and I recommend this strategy to anyone who's already learned 5 taps the traditional way. One final note that Dog mentions is that throughout his time as a roller, he's noticed much less movement of his controller. Regarding this, Dog says that the better handle you have of your controller movements, the better your quick taps will be. So while everything I've covered so far is how the majority of players roll, I want to quickly go over a few alternative grips. The 3 grips I'll be going over are knuckle rolling, a version of rolling that is less taxing on the hands, Jerpy grip, an unorthodox grip developed by the player Jerpy, as well as methods to roll on keyboard if you don't have access to a controller. We'll begin by going over knuckle rolling, which is actually a pretty recent development. To start, we first must look at Matt Martin, a veteran Dash player who toyed around with rolling for some time. Matt experimented with a lot of different grips, such as using the back of his hand, using his teeth as an anchor, or even a method called tolling proposed by veteran player Josh Tolles, which involved wrapping the controller wire around his finger and sliding it across the back. Just as a side note, Matt goes over all of this in his beginner tips for rolling video, which I highly recommend you watch. Out of everything Matt tried, however, one idea that had a bit more promise was using his knuckles to roll. In the end though, Matt Martin was never able to fully realize any of these, but there was one player who succeeded in doing so. Enter Pixelandy, former world record holder and 3rd player to crash the game. Andy was an extremely dominant player, but unfortunately injured his hands around early 2024. This made rolling the normal way very painful, and he was unable to perform well during this period. This was about the time Matt Martin showed Andy knuckle rolling at the Stillwater Regional, where Andy decided to double down on the idea. After 6 months, Andy became proficient with the method and was once again able to put up the scores he was known for before. Regarding how to knuckle roll, the concept behind it is pretty intuitive, where instead of using your fingertips, you use your knuckles to roll. Just to note, the knuckles you roll with are the smaller ones on your fingers, not the larger ones on your hands. Andy's finger order for knuckle rolling goes from index finger to pinky before ending it off with a quick tap. Overall, Andy says knuckling is much harder to control but requires less dexterity. I can attest to knuckling being less taxing, as I have also experienced similar injury from rolling. For some time, I began to feel great pain in the tendons of my wrist whenever my fingers hit the controller. However, Andy's knuckle rolling allows someone to still roll without having to hit the base of their fingers, preventing any pain that would be caused this way. Aside from having a comfort use, knuckle rolling does have one real advantage over normal rolling, which is that your range of motion is much smaller. With normal rolling, you have to reopen your fingers after every roll. However, with knuckle rolling, your fingers stay bent from start to finish. This gives you more time to physically and mentally prepare for the next roll. The next grip we'll be talking about is Jerpy grip. Rather than planting the controller on a surface, Jerpy instead holds the controller more conventionally, that being in the air with both hands. To get all 5 inputs with this grip, Jerpy rolls the bottom of her knuckles off the corner of the controller and finishes it off with a quick tap. She says the motion is similar to snapping with your fingers, but with the controller in the way. The main advantage of using this grip is that you're holding the controller the standard way. This makes the grip the easiest to transition from other playstyles, such as dash back to rolling at will. Because of this grip may be useful for dash players learning how to roll, since you can always fall back on dash as a safety net if controlling your rolling becomes too difficult. Jerpy states that the main challenges of this grip are getting 2 taps and 5 taps, however she does give some pointers on how to approach them. For 2 taps, Drippy will often press her D-pad twice instead of rolling, which is also known as slow tapping. For 5 taps, Drippy will twist her wrist and thumb at the end of the roll. To practice this motion, Drippy recommends trying to move pieces using only the index finger and thumb, which are the last 2 fingers needed for 5 taps. Now, what if you don't have a console and controller, but would still like to roll? Luckily, players have also developed ways to roll on keyboards, where you roll on the top of your hand rather than the bottom. The first person to ever show this is Adrian Wu, all the way back in November of 2020. At this point, rolling had not been fully figured out yet, and he merely used it to move pieces quickly in the no rotation category. This video from Adrian actually has a lot of historical significance, as this is the first public footage of rolling. While Cheese had discovered rolling by this point, he was hesitant to reveal his methods so as to save the community from infinite kill screen. However, seeing this video made Cheese think that others would eventually figure out his technique, which finally pushed him to make controller rolling public. In recent years, keyboard rolling has been once again popularized by the player Akatu, who was kind enough to share how to keyboard roll and what challenges come with it. First, to rotate, Akatu places his left ring finger on A and his middle finger on D. To move, Akatu places his index finger on either V or B. With his rolling hand, Akatu goes from pinky to index finger and uses a quick tap to get his 5th movement in. Moving on to challenges, one big issue with this playstyle is that your success with keyboard rolling depends on what keyboard you have. For example, the keyboard Akatu initially used wasn't able to register more than 24 Hz, which to put into context is the difference between making and hanging a long bar 10 high to the right on 29. Additionally, Akatu mentions that in general, keyboard rolling is much more difficult than normal rolling. For these reasons, he doesn't recommend keyboard rolling to anyone looking to compete at the highest level. Akatu does go on to say though, that perhaps there just isn't a good enough keyboard player yet to prove it's just as good as controller. Now, while keyboard rolling was made to be used on, keyboard, one player has been able to use the style of rolling on an actual controller. Featured once again in this video, we have Blue Scooty. Scooty's grip for Akatu style rolling is the same as his normal rolling grip, just on a table now. Like how Akatu rolls on his pointer finger, Scooty rolls on his thumb to get the inputs in. The advantage of this grip is that it allows existing keyboard players to smoothly transition to controller, which would let them play in live events. However, this grip does have a few pretty glaring disadvantages. Firstly, the area to hit is much smaller when compared to normal rolling, and secondly, you could hit your thumb out of place, which would end your game instantly on higher speeds. In the end, Scooty shares the same sentiment as Akatu, where becoming a top player would be much easier with normal rolling, as this method is simply more difficult for the same reward. Before finally moving on to how to use rolling in-game, I want to go over some of the accessories players use outside of the game. Something you might have been wondering about is why in almost all of the clips I've been using, the players are wearing gloves. The main reason for this is to remove any friction while rolling. Without a glove, the sweat of one's fingertips will accumulate more and more throughout a game, making your rolls less consistent, whereas with a glove, your fingers slide right off. Additionally, the glove reduces impact on the fingertips, which makes rolling overall a lot less painful. When choosing a glove to use, you don't want anything with any sort of grip, since that would defeat the whole point of removing friction, so any cloth or silk glove that's relatively thin should get the job done. One thing to note about using gloves is that they do wear out after long periods of use. A thinner glove can mess with your rolling, so be sure to replace them once you see they're becoming too worn out. Overall, you'll see most top players opting to use gloves. However, the main exception to this is 2023's world champion Fractal, who opts to use lotion to remove friction instead. Speaking of Fractal, he's also experimented using a sticky pad on his leg to keep his controller in place. When asked about his experience with this, Fractal says he saw an immediate increase in his play, which is evident when looking at the tournaments he dominated in. However, after a while, Fractal decided that it was worse for him as the surface became too sticky and it was harder to move the controller around. While hardly any players use sticky pads today, Fractal does still recommend it for people who may want to try it out. Aside from the sticky pad, you can also experiment with different materials to hold the controller in place, such as the player eyeball using a rubber band around his entire leg. I've left a link in the description to a page on the Classic Tetris Monthly website, which gives the Amazon links to all of the materials I've talked about here and more. I'll also leave links for any additional equipment I find. If you don't know where to start, you could try beginning with Eric's gloves due to them coming in large quantities and being pretty cheap. However, this is just my recommendation, and you should use whichever equipment suits you the best. Now that you've chosen your grip and want to play the game, where do you start from here? The hardest part of the initial learning stage is figuring out how to rotate and move the pieces at the same time. So let's take this in steps. First, you should get the hang of moving the pieces without rotating. The best way to practice this is through the level select, since it's a clear and fast way to see how many inputs actually register. You shouldn't worry about rotations too much until you're at least able to get 4 taps, given that 4 is the number of inputs needed to score a Tetris. Aside from using level select, you should also try playing on slower levels just to throw the pieces left and right. This is so you can clearly see how your rolling makes the pieces move, and so you can also practice timing your movement to when the pieces spawn. If you're having trouble moving the pieces and with rolling in general, you can skip forward to the troubleshooting section of this video, where I cover in detail different ways to fix your rolling. As your 1 to 4 taps become more consistent, try going faster and faster until you're comfortable rolling at higher speeds. In addition to just moving the pieces fast, it's also important to make sure your rolls are even. The way rolling works is that you can't roll on every frame, since an input every frame is essentially the same thing as holding down the button. Because of this, the most optimal rolling is a roll every other frame, or rolling every 30th of a second. Getting a perfect roll is incredibly precise, as you'd expect. However, to get as close as there as possible, you want to make sure each finger hits the controller for about the same amount of time, and that your fingers are well spaced enough so that they don't clump together. Once you can get your pieces moving at a speed you're happy with, now you can start adding in rotations. Perform the same process of throwing pieces to the wall, but this time, click one of the rotation buttons at the same time. Learning the orientations of the rotated piece doesn't matter, as this exercise is solely meant for you to build up muscle memory. As to when to rotate the piece, top players like Miles and Fractal both rotate in the middle of their rolls, so try to aim for something not too early but not too late. Make sure to practice rolling and rotating in both directions, and practice double flipping the pieces as well. Once you feel you have the muscle memory down, try starting on a very low level to play an actual game. At this point, you'll likely be spending a good amount of time on each piece, so take your time to learn how each piece rotates and how it feels to place pieces in the correct positions. From there, keep increasing the speed every time you feel comfortable, until finally, you'll be able to roll like a natural. As for learning 5 taps, I wouldn't worry about them too much initially, as 1 to 4 taps and rotations are much more important, and 5 taps usually tend to be the hardest part when learning how to roll. I will say though, that you should figure out if you want to be a quick tapper or a traditional 5 tapper early on, so that as you get the hang of 1 to 4 taps, you can still practice going for 5 taps even if they don't turn out good initially. Next, I'll be going over some potential fixes for problems you might be having with 5 taps. If your problem with 5 taps is that 2 fingers are clumping together, I would recommend playing games on lower speeds and moving the pieces exclusively using those 2 fingers. For me, this happened with my pinky and ring finger, but eventually these 2 were able to separate. If your problem with 5 taps is your thumb input, then I recommend you focus on twisting your wrist at the end of your roll so the base of your thumb is facing upwards by the end. This doesn't really apply to the top of the thigh grip, where your thumb is facing upwards by default, but it does hold true for both the side of the thigh and foot grip. And finally, if you're having problems quick tapping, you're most likely quick tapping too early, so I recommend consciously waiting until you know all your fingers have rolled over before adding the quick tap in. As you become more and more confident that you're quick tapping after you roll, gradually speed up how fast you're rolling so you can practice getting your quick tap as close to the end of your roll as possible. With enough practice, your 5 taps, like everything else, will eventually become muscle memory. One of the most asked questions in the Tetris community is how can I get better at rolling? To be blunt, the answer is to keep practicing. In order to improve your rolling techniques and mechanics, you just have to keep playing until you fully develop the muscle memory and reaction time needed to play on higher speeds. But if you were looking for something more specific, here's a list of common practice methods. If all you have is an original cartridge of NES Tetris and nothing else, playing B-Type will be your best method of practice since you can learn how to dig and are forced to do very fast rolls. Vanilla cartridges allow you to play up to 19.5, which is level 19 speed with 12 rolls of garbage. Next, If you have access to a Game Genie or ways to put in Game Genie codes, you can use the code GPTEPG to make holding A while pressing start increase the level by 20 rather than 10. This will allow you to start on level 29, which will give you first-hand practice with the fastest speed in the game. In combination with GPTEPG, you can also use the code 6TOCKLE, which increases the level every 10 lines you clear. This can help you simulate how an actual game would feel, since without this code, you won't initially transition on a 29 start unless you first cleared hundreds of lines. Additionally, you can also decrease the amount of rows to play on using the codes shown on screen. By playing higher, especially on level 29, this will force you to have solid mechanics and to roll faster if you want to survive. A popular height to practice on is floor 6, where you definitely need really good mechanics, but it isn't as if every roll needs to be 30 Hz. Play around and see which height suits you the best. Feel free to also use the code OPPEX to skip the rocket screen animation that happens if you score above 30,000. This is just used to save time. Finally, the next set of codes are a bit niche, but were something I used when just starting out. The codes OZPOEO and ZAPOOO, when used together, give you a very high chance to spawn squares on any given piece. I use this code to practice getting pieces over on level 29 without having to worry about other pieces getting in the way. Though with these codes, you're unable to practice 5 taps since squares only move 4 inputs to the left and right. Finally, over the years, the Tetris community has created many specialized practice tools that target all aspects of playing. There are far too many to cover here, but if you'd really like to up your game, I've left a link to the Classic Tetris Monthly Discord in the description, where you can ask around and find out more. Moving on from practice methods, we'll quickly touch upon some benchmarks to track your improvement. In general, the community likes to look at personal bests in 100,000 point increments. However, some of these increments stand out much more than others. The first major milestone to hit is 1 million points, also known as a max out. Having a max out shows that you have good stacking fundamentals and good enough rolling mechanics to score Tetrises on levels 18 and 19, though your kill screen play probably isn't fully developed at this point. Next is what I consider the necessary kill screen range of personal bests, which are from 1.3 to 1.6 million. You can technically score a 1.3 to 1.5 without needing kill screen, however you would need to be extraordinarily efficient, and scoring 1.6 million definitely requires kill screen. All in all, getting these scores typically require that you can survive on level 29 speeds for extended amounts of time. Either that, or have proficient enough stacking and mechanics to score Tetrises on the kill screen. Finally, any personal best above 2 million means that you're a highly advanced player who is comfortable playing on 29 speeds. Personal best above this point usually tend to be large jumps, since if you're able to play long enough to reach 2 million, you can probably play much longer and achieve much higher as well. Regarding level 29 personal bests, if you're starting out, then I suggest you focus on clearing lines rather than going for score, since lining out will ground your fundamentals on this speed much better. The first major milestone is reaching 100 lines. This would mean that if you played a tournament match, you could theoretically hit the level 39 line cap. For reference, in competition, a level 39 line cap is enforced, so games don't take too long, and because scoring Tetrises is generally more exciting to watch than players lining out. Getting to 100 lines requires a lot of focus and a good understanding of how to survive on the kill screen. At this point though, your mechanics and overall stacking may not be fully figured out yet. The second major milestone is reaching 200 lines. On a typical level 29 start, you would transition to level 30 at this point. Getting to 200 lines is a testament to one's stamina and ability to play proficiently on this speed. Finally, anything above 300 lines shows a general mastery of level 29, being able to play on the fastest speed like it's second nature. Moving on, regarding how fast you should be improving, there isn't a concrete timeline of how good you should be at a certain point, since people improve at different rates. However, one thing I will say is to never overestimate your skill. With the nature of rolling allowing you to play very far, it's very possible to fluke overly high scores early on. However, this can result in major roadblocks when players are unable to reach such heights afterwards. When you're starting out with rolling, set reasonable goals, and even if you completely shatter them early, continue being honest with yourself about what your skill level actually is. Doing this will make progression a lot more gratifying. This applies to everything with Tetris, but applies most with rolling. Of course, if you want to improve your stacking, the process is the same as with any other playstyle. watch top players to see where they place the pieces, and compare their decisions to yours. With rolling, this especially applies to level 29 stacking. If you want to learn how to score Tetrises on 29, I have the world record for the earliest 29 max out and most points scored from levels 29 to 39. Feel free to watch any of my games, but aside from me, Alex T and Blue Scooty are absolute menaces of scoring 29 Tetrises and are great to base your games off of. For learning how to stack for survival, also known as lining out, there is no better person to watch than Dog, who has the first and currently only rebirth, and has also won No Cap November in 2024, a tournament where there isn't any line cap. Finally, I'd like to introduce you to two of the best tools for general improvement, these being Greg Cannon's NES Tetris Trainer and Ansel aka Primer's Nestris.org. Greg's website makes use of his Tetris AI named StackRabbit, which he coded entirely by himself. On the website, you can make any board you want, and StackRabbit can generate the best possible move given the current piece and the next piece. Primer's website, Nestris.org, builds upon this by using the code for StackRabbit to generate puzzles where you match the AI's best move against your own. Nestris.org also allows you to directly play against other players, making it a great tool for practicing tournament play. Both websites are essential resources for any rising player, and I highly recommend checking them out. Sometimes, your rolling just doesn't feel right and it can be very frustrating. This section is here to help with that, where I'll be going over all forms of troubleshooting when it comes to rolling. This is a very important topic with it being relevant to even top players, so I'll be splitting this section into 3 parts. First, troubleshooting regarding rolling technique. Secondly, troubleshooting regarding your controller. And third, troubleshooting regarding double flips. We'll start with rolling technique. Regarding problems with your rolling technique, here's a quick list of potential issues you might be having. 1. Are you rolling too hard or too soft? This is a factor I often find with myself, where if I roll too hard, it doesn't allow for good separation of my fingers. Relaxing my hand and maintaining a smooth motion allows me to roll much better. 2. Are you applying too much or too little thumb pressure? With your anchor hand, make sure you're not applying too much thumb pressure where the game thinks you're holding down the button, but enough force that your inputs will actually register. 3. Are you rolling too fast or too slow? Sometimes, you might not be getting pieces all the way to their destination because you're rolling too slow. However, if you roll too fast, it may lead to one of your inputs being connected to another and thus not registering. 4. How are the timing of your rolls? The goal when playing is to start rolling on the very first frame the piece spawns. If you roll before the piece spawns, then you won't get all your inputs in, and if you roll too long after the piece spawns, your piece might hit the stack before all your inputs go through. 5. Is the angle of the controller correct? Sometimes, you may be holding your controller more slanted or more upright than normal, which can mess with the angle of your rolling hand. 6. How far are your hands from the controller? When rolling, I tend to roll the best when the very tips of my fingers graze the controller, allowing them to slide right off and not get caught. Because of this, I make sure not to roll too close to the controller to prevent my fingers from getting stuck. For the most part, when your technique is off, these are the main issues you should consider. However, there are some external factors to look out for as well. 1. How comfortable is the surface you're rolling on? Personally, I'm usually fine with planting my controller on any surface, as long as it's smooth and not bumpy, but I do know players who need to play in shorts as opposed to long pants, so they can use their skin for some extra stability. 2. How long are your nails? Typically, if the nails on my rolling hand are too short, I can't get as good of a roll as with longer nails. 3. How's the height of your chair? If the chair you're sitting on is too tall or too short for your liking, your legs may be strained, which prevents you from having a solid foundation for rolling. 4. How is your mindset? Even if your rolling is perfect, you might still be missing rolls because of how you're thinking. From personal experience, if I'm scared of going for 5 taps, I usually can't make them, but if I'm confident, I can hit them more consistently. Some of these factors may sound silly, but in high-level tournaments with thousands of dollars on the line, players need to remove every possible variable that may hurt their play. Next up, we'll move on to controller troubleshooting. The properties of one's controller can make as much of a difference as your rolling technique, so many top players put a large emphasis on ensuring their controllers are functional. When fixing your controller, there are 2 main factors to look at: how tight your controller is, and the parts inside of the controller. We'll start with tightness. Sometimes if you can't roll properly, it may be due to the controller being too tight or too loose. To fix this, we'll be looking at the screws on the back of the controller. While all of the screws affect the overall tightness to some extent, I usually focus on these 4 screws on the back. These screws are the ones around the D-pad and will allow you to adjust the tightness for each direction. The middle screws affect your right input, and the corner screws affect your left. Take some time to experiment, and eventually you'll find a tightness you'll get used to. If you've messed around too much and need to find a reset point, tighten every screw to their max so that all screws are in the same state, and go unloosing each from there. If you like your controller really loose, you might even find success taking out some screws. Players like Huffaluffagus and the Asian play with very few screws in their controllers, with Huff alternating between 1 and 3 screws, and the Asian using no screws at all. Aside from tightness, the parts inside of the controller may be the issue. We'll start with the most important part, which is the D-pad rubber. Depending on the manufacturer, different pads have different stiffnesses, but will either be categorized as clicky, which require more pressure to press down, or mushy, which require less pressure. After conducting a poll about which pads players use, most players prefer having clickier pads, but there are a still good number of players who prefer mushy. Those who prefer clicky say that mushy D-pads tend to drop inputs and that the clickiness is able to give you live feedback of how your rolling is. Those who prefer mushy say that rolling flows much nicer on mushy pads and that the less pressure needed makes it easier to account for if one of your fingers doesn't roll hard enough. For me, I would say I lean more on the mushy side since I prefer not worrying about how much thumb pressure I'm putting on. However, I won't play with any D-pad that's so mushy it doesn't even feel like I'm pressing on it. Keep all these differences in mind when you start rolling, as one type of D-pad may suit you better than the other. If you're looking to buy spare parts, OEM pads, which are the original pads used in official controllers, usually tend to be more mushy since they've had over 40 years of use. Whereas third-party pads are typically more clicky since they use a different material and haven't been broken in yet. However, if a pad is too stiff and you'd like to play with something looser, I'll direct you to this tutorial by the player Wallbant about how to cut D-pads to reduce stiffness. Wallbant has been a great help with this section of the guide in general, so be sure to check him out. Something else to note is that your pads may tear after long periods of usage, so if your rolling consistently feels off no matter how you alter your technique, it may be due to a broken D-pad. If the buttons just don't feel like they used to, it might be a good time to open your controller and check if any of your pads have ripped. Alternatively, the pads may be fine, but the motherboard is the problem. This may be the case if you have random spurts of inputs or if nothing you do is registering. To fix this, you could clean the motherboard using alcohol, however I found much better success with just swapping out the faulty one with a good one. Here's a quick demonstration of how to open an NES controller if you want to replace your parts. First, you need a small crosshead screwdriver. Next, flip the controller over and take out all 6 of the screws. It's a good idea to make a note of which screws came from which holes, so that when you put everything back together, the controller will be basically the same as before you opened it. Once all the screws are out, carefully take off the back cover. With the controller now open, take out the motherboard, making sure not to straighten the wire. This is important for putting the controller back together. From there, you can clean the inside with alcohol and replace the pads as you please. When putting the controller back together, place the motherboard wire in the same orientation you found it in, and then cover the controller again, where it should slide right into place. If you see parts of the controller bulging, then the wire connected to the motherboard isn't in the correct position and is holding parts of the controller open. If this is happening, adjust the wire near the middle of the motherboard until the controller is able to smoothly close. Alternatively, one of the rubbers may not be fully pressed down, which can also cause bulging. Once everything is good, put the screws back in, and now your controller is good for use once again. The only concern with all of this is that NES controllers, especially official ones, are very prone to getting stripped screws, where the notches have been worn away. This is extremely important to know because once stripped, the screws become virtually impossible to get out, so if you want to start messing with your controller, be very wary about how worn out your screws are. If you can see that a screw is close to being stripped, immediately replace it with a fresh screw from another controller. In this final part about troubleshooting, I'll be going over double flips, which are a very common issue with rolling. Sometimes you'll be playing just fine when suddenly your controller malfunctions and you rotate twice. Double flips are a complex topic and aren't fully understood within the community. However, the two main causes that most people agree on are problems with your controller and problems with your rolling mechanics. We'll start by discussing the controller, where double flips are caused by motherboard or pad issues. The button pads, just like the D-pad, can also rip and lead to problems, and as mentioned earlier, your motherboard when faulty can also cause random inputs. If double flips are being caused by faulty parts, they tend to happen a lot more randomly and can even happen with other playstyles like DAS. When this is the case, cleaning the parts with alcohol or simply replacing them will help. However, it can be a lottery at times whether the parts are right for the controller you're putting them in. From personal experience, sometimes changing my button rubbers doesn't help at all, and other times it'll only be a temporary fix, where I won't double flip for a few days, but after a while, they'll start happening again. However, no mechanics can make up for a controller that incorrectly registers inputs, so through experimentation, try your best to find parts that suit you well. Next, onto problems with rolling mechanics. Double flips this way are caused by the lingering vibrations of rolling affecting your rotations as well. Think of it as accidentally rolling the rotation buttons instead of just the D-pad. If you feel like this is the issue that pertains to you, here are a few countermeasures. The first might be pretty niche, but I find that my A button always double flips while my B button never does. This may have to do with the A button being closer to the edge, making it more susceptible to these vibrations. Whatever the explanation may be, having at least one rotate button that is consistent is extremely helpful because in NES Tetris, the S piece, Z piece, and I piece all rotate the same regardless of which button is used. This means, as long as I'm aware that I'm rotating using B, I shouldn't have problems with double flips. An alternate strategy comes from Fractal, who recommends pressing the rotation buttons firmly and aiming for the center of the buttons as much as possible. This would make sense if double flips are due to vibrations, as pressing the buttons firmly would keep the pads rigid. All in all, what makes double flips such a pain is that it's so hard to pinpoint what the root cause is. Sometimes you'll be spending so much time changing your parts only to figure out that your problem was your mechanics. Or even if you do need to change your parts, you won't know for sure if they're good for you, even if they haven't been used at all. Regardless, double flips are just an annoyance every player has to deal with, so try your best to make them as infrequent as possible. Over the last year, however, players Opox and Ava have been working on a project called Padless. These are NES controllers that aim to fix problems like double flips by using the same hardware found in gaming mice and mechanical keyboards. Padless is currently in the final prototyping stages, and I'll leave a link to their storefront if you want to learn more. Quick disclaimer though, Padless is currently not allowed for in-person CTWC events. However, Opox and Ava say that they are working to push towards legality. What if you are completely new to Tetris and don't have the stacking knowledge or ability to play on the faster speeds? You might be wondering whether to start with rolling or to get the hang of the game with another playstyle first. After conducting a community poll, the majority agreed that you shouldn't start with rolling. However, there is a case for both sides. I'll first go over reasons to not start with rolling. The main argument is that the other two playstyles, dash and tap, are much easier to learn than rolling. This means you won't have to tackle the challenge of learning how to roll and learning how to stack at the same time. Furthermore, the slower nature of the other playstyles also helps to better ground your fundamentals. With the freedom rolling gives, being able to throw pieces wherever, survival is never a concern until it's usually too late. With the slower playstyles, where the area to play is more limited, you can better ingrain basic survival fundamentals, like building out your left or making double wells for safety. These fundamentals still apply for rolling and are extremely important, so being able to develop them in the first place is something that the other playstyles excel at compared to rolling. Now onto why you should start with rolling. The main argument here is that if you aim to be a top player, you're gonna need to be good at rolling anyways. With this in mind, starting with rolling and mastering your mechanics early on will be much more useful in the long run than practicing another playstyle that won't get you as far. While there are more tournaments exclusively for other playstyles nowadays, it doesn't change the fact that rolling still stands at the peak of everything. Additionally, if you start rolling after already becoming proficient with another playstyle, it might be much harder to find motivation to completely start over after you already sank hours into playing the game a different way. Taking all of this into consideration, I would suggest something that combines aspects of both. Rolling is very fun to do, and I wouldn't push anyone away from just attempting it. And since rolling does take time to fully develop, you won't be able to master it instantly anyways. During the time you are toying around with rolling, you can also try messing around with other playstyles to get a better feel of the game, and so that you can still be making progress even if your rolling isn't taking off. This way, you can get the best of both worlds, where by the time you're proficient enough with rolling, you also have a good enough understanding of the game to actually use your rolling. In the end, it just comes down to personal preference of when you want to learn rolling on your Tetris journey. Finally, for what might be the most important part of this guide, I'll be going over the risks and potential injuries that may come with rolling, as well as how to prevent them. With rolling being so physically intensive on the hands, there's been a history of players having to take breaks due to injury, making this a topic of great concern. Luckily for us, Guerrero, a highly respected member of the Latin American Tetris community, happens to be a practicing physician in Colombia. A while back, Guerrero conducted a survey asking players the type of injuries they sustained from rolling. I reached out to him asking a few questions about rolling safety, and this is what he has to say. We'll start broad, then get into more specific injuries, and then finally go over ways to prevent them. The biggest risks with rolling are the possible long-term effects that could come with any injury. Repeated strain on an existing injury may lead to chronification, which is when the pain becomes persistent even when not doing the activity. With rolling, chronification comes in the form of tendinosis, where damage to tendons cannot heal correctly, leading to chronic pain and weakness sensation. Tendinosis can be treated, however in very severe cases, the condition will only benefit from surgical treatment. Getting more specific, with rolling, injuries mainly form in the rolling hand and anchor hand. Starting with the rolling hand, the injuries tend to be related to conditions that generate pain and sometimes numbness in the fingers, wrists, and forearm. Injuries in the rolling hand are usually due to how it's positioned and from its repetitive movement, which can lead to strain-related nerve compression and muscle damage. These are some of the conditions relating to this hand that Guerrero cites. Feel free to pause and find out more if you're interested. Moving on to the anchor hand, Guerrero says that the injuries here are mainly related to having to multitask. This leads to uncomfortable positions for the hand. The main locations where pain and damage occur on this hand are the fingers used for anchoring, the wrist, the hand, and the thumb. These are some of the conditions relating to this hand that Guerrero cites. Regarding carpal tunnel syndrome in particular, there seems to be a much higher risk of developing it in the anchor hand, potentially related to the hand positioning and multitasking functions that can lead to muscle tension in multiple parts of the hand. Referring to the survey mentioned earlier, 31.3% of players reported feeling numbness in their anchor hand, while only 4.2% of players reported numbness in their rolling hand. Aside from the hands, other parts of the body may be also affected by one's grip and posture. Sitting uncomfortably may lead to back pain, as well as lower limb pain and body soreness. So with all of this in mind, how do you go about handling these injuries? The main measure would be to prevent them from happening in the first place. Some preventatives are as follows. First, before rolling, it's a good idea to warm up your hands or to do stretching routines. Next, if you're playing and your grip doesn't feel natural, try switching your grip to something more ergonomic. For example, if your anchor hand is hurting, try having it in a more slumped position rather than an upright position. Or if your rolling hand is hurting, you could try switching to knuckle rolling. You want to ultimately pick a grip that feels the most comfortable for you, while also considering using as few limbs and body parts as possible to decrease strain. Additionally, keep in mind symmetry and balance for spine health. For example, grips that allow you to sit straight are much better for your spine and lower limb health than grips that force you to lean forwards. Finally, be sure to manage your playing time and take breaks when necessary. Understanding your physical condition and taking steps to prevent serious injury would be your main goal if you're just starting out with rolling. If you're already dealing with an injury, getting a diagnosis from a professional will help you better identify what is wrong and what the most beneficial treatment is for your case. The backbone for these types of treatment usually consists of physical therapy and reducing whatever straining activity is causing the condition. If symptoms persist even after treatment, you should get medical attention and try to get a diagnostic image such as an ultrasound to evaluate structural damage. Finally, I want to close this section by promoting Guerrero's Discord server, the Classic Tetris Doctor. In this server, you'll find all the data from the surveys and even more in-depth analysis than what I've given here. Additionally, players can consult Guerrero about their cases and he will personally help them with their problems. If you're a roller and are wary about or already facing injuries, I highly suggest that you join this server. And with that, that's everything I wanted to cover about rolling. Huge thanks to Dog, Andy, Fractal, Sodium, and Miles for helping look over the script and video throughout all of production. This video would not be possible without their help. Shoutouts to my dad for being the biggest supporter of this project and giving me feedback on everything. Special thanks to Cheese, Scooty, Matt Martin, Jerpy, Akatu, Wallbant, Opox and Ava, and Guerrero for helping me with their areas of expertise. I've left their relevant links in the description if you want to check them out. Thanks to my chat for giving me extra feedback on the video, and thank you for watching till the end. This is by far my biggest and most ambitious project I've ever done, and it's been so much fun throughout the entire process of making it. It's pretty surreal seeing this video actually done, and I'm really happy to see just how much I've grown as an editor throughout the past 3 years. If you want to see more of me, I stream once in a while on my YouTube and Twitch, but other than that, I hope you enjoyed, and I wish you all the best on your Tetris journeys.